Hi, welcome to my lecture for assignment number 11. This is going to be my last substantive or big lecture for the course. I'll make a couple more appearances, but I don't expect to present very much new subject matter at all. This lecture is going to be on the introduction in chapters 1 and 2 of Marjorie Kelly and Ted Howard's Making a Democratic Economy. And here I'm going to get the general ideas of the book in place, and some of the key facts and from the book, and like what the project is in the book and how it relates to the course themes. But as you'll see, after chapter 2, beginning with chapter 2, actually, you have a bunch of case studies of different firms or forms of economic organization, initiatives that embody the principles that are set out in the first couple of chapters. This book, I think you'll experience it as a very easy read. It's very, it's more of a case study. It's a number of case studies, just making a tightly related set of points that's trying to describe a movement or an initiative to make what these folks are referring to as a democratic economy. But let me just, in this lecture, let me just give you like a little bit of a framework, a little bit of orientation of what's going on there, and I'll follow up in subsequent lectures with material that has to do, I think, more with just helping you synthesize the course themes and such. But anyway, last bit of content here from Making a Democratic Economy. Okay, so first, let me make sure that everyone has a pretty good grasp of a distinction between the wealth or net worth of a person or a household and the income of a person or a household. Wealth is basically your assets, say the value of your house, your cars, your stocks. We've been talking about stocks that shareholders own, and so on. And what you want to make sure to get your net worth or your wealth, you want to make sure to net out what you might owe on these various things to get your true net worth. By contrast, income is your earnings. The salary you get for wherever you work. Maybe you get income from stocks you own, or maybe you own a house and you're able to rent it out and get income in that way. But wealth and income are two different things. But we can talk about inequality or equality of either of these things. We can talk about folks having, we can talk about equality of wealth or quality of income. Those are two different dimensions, and they need not go together, but they usually do. Okay, so this Kelly and Howard book, the Making a Democratic Economy, it begins with a kind of litany of facts about inequality of wealth and income. And let me, particularly given what's going on in the world right now, particularly south of the border in the U.S., let me identify some of the facts that these folks rehearse for us that are about inequality, that relate to inequality along racial lines. And I think the folks that are writing this book see some of these racial inequalities and racial injustices as bound up with the structure of the underlying economy. And so, repairing the economy is a key way that you go about repairing some of these injustices along racial lines. And that really comes out as you read the case studies in the book. But let me just begin with some things. So first let me begin with something that is floating around in the Twitter sphere. That isn't actually in the book, but I think it's worth pointing out. There's a Boston Fed report. It's a report of the Federal Reserve in Boston, and they're analyzing. Right now, it's a report analyzing median net worth of folks in the Boston area. Boston's this pretty big city on the eastern seaboard in the U.S. And here is a really stark inequality that is being noted. And this is all, related to what's going on in the states, in response to well, the spark is the murder of George Floyd, but it's in response to this systematic, inequality and injustice along racial lines. But anyway, so this thing that's you can find in the Twitter sphere, it notes that the median net worth, median amount of assets of a white family in Boston is $247,000, whereas the median net worth of a black family in Boston is $8. That's a pretty incredible disparity, and that is not a typo. No, really, $8. Um, Now, in the book, I mentioned that just to give a kind of backdrop. So the book begins, the Making a Democratic Economy book, it begins its chapter 1 with a description of Chris Brown and Chris Brown's neighborhood in Cleveland. And, in many American cities, you see disparities in wealth and income like those you see in Boston. But what he points out, what the book points out, is that in Chris Brown's neighborhood in Cleveland, his neighborhood's 95% black, and in that neighborhood there's 24% unemployment. And this is, way before COVID. This is like pre-COVID Chris Brown's neighborhood. You might be seeing 24% unemployment because of the lockdowns now, more generally in the economy, but this is like a neighborhood where that's just the norm. And the median annual income in his neighborhood is $19,000 American. I've put a link here to a really interesting piece. This isn't in our readings, but it supports the same general idea. I've put a link here to this piece that describes this part of Madison, Wisconsin, called the Crescent. And this is a largely African American and Hispanic area of Wisconsin, of Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin, by the way, is really well regarded. It's thought of as a liberal haven, this big university town, big famous university there, the University of Wisconsin. But there's this it's a highly segregated city, and the Crescent is where you have this segregated community of blacks and Hispanics. And if you click through this link, you're going to see multiple dimensions that measure the income and wealth and generally general life prospect inequalities for this community versus the surrounding white community. Okay, now, so there are some general facts about inequality along racial lines, some of which you find in the opening pages of the material we're reading for today. Now, here's some more general facts about inequality of wealth and income, and we've seen some facts like this before, particularly in the Schweikert and Anderson had a bit to say about this, but I'm going to rehearse some of them just so you can see that, look, they're thinking about inequalities much in the way that Schweikert and Anderson are thinking about inequalities. One thing, so 26 billionaires, that is 26 people who have wealth of $1 billion or more throughout the world. There are 26 of these folks, and they own as much wealth as half the planet's population. So 26 people versus, well, what's the population of the globe right now? It's 7 billion people. They own as much wealth as, these 26 people own as much wealth as, roughly 3.5 billion people. The three wealthiest men in the U.S., Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett. You've probably heard of all of those folks. Jeff Bezos is the CEO of Amazon. Bill Gates, he's retired, but he founded and was the CEO of Microsoft. And then Warren Buffett has a hedge fund, Berkshire Hathaway. These folks own more wealth than the bottom half of the American population combined. So these three folks own as much as 160 million people in the United States. The bottom half, the bottom wealth folks in the United States. Since 2009, 95% of income gains in the United States have gone to top 1% income earners. That's that stagnant wages thing that Mark Blythe talked about. That's another data point on that. 47% of Americans cannot put together even $400 in the face of an emergency. If you want to check like where these numbers are coming from, Howard and Kelly, they document it with footnotes. You can chase down the footnotes to make sure that this stuff is, where the source is for these little numbers. But anyway, 47% of Americans cannot put together even $400 in the face of an emergency. And then 40% of jobs in the U.S. are insecure, part-time, contract, gig economy type work. So the idea is that so they rehearse this litany of facts about the inequality of wealth and income. And here at the bottom, this last one, kind of life prospects or kind of economic security in general. Okay. Now, what the book is generally concerned with, and this just directly lines up with what Anderson and Schweikert are concerned with, is what the book calls capital bias. This book, uses this term capital bias, and basically it's this idea that there's two general classes in the United States. There is the capital owning class, the folks that own wealth, mainly in the form of stocks, and the idea is that the rules of the system taken together manifest an unequal consideration of interests. The interests of the folks that are the capital owners, the shareholders and such, are accorded greater weight. They're treated disproportionately favorably versus the interests of your sort of rank and file worker who makes money, by through income as opposed to the wealth that they own. And so, Kelly says in the introduction, Howard and Kelly say in the introduction, capital bias is often advanced by policy, as with lower taxes on capital gains than on labor income. So you might not know this, but certainly in the United States, and this is true in Canada as well, the taxes you pay for the income you get from the appreciation of your stock is at a significantly lower rate than the taxes you pay for income earned. So in the United States, I think right now it's like you pay something like a 15% income on capital gains. So if you had $100,000 of stock and it appreciates to $150,000 and you sell it for 50, you pay 15% of that 50,000 income in taxes. Whereas in the United States, typical, tax brackets, someone making $50,000, someone making $150,000 or so would be taxed at a marginal rate of, 25, 30, 35, 40%. So you get this in policy, you'll get these things where like, why is it that, capital gains get taxed at a lower rate than regular income? There's bailouts for big banks, but not for ordinary homeowners. There's right now with the COVID stuff. There's bailouts that are happening through the central banks of Canada and the United States, and there's some questions about whose interests are being favored in these bailouts. And there's some arguments that looks like the corporate sector, which is ultimately shareholders, they're getting supports that regular folks are not getting from these central bank bailouts. There's tax breaks given to large corporations that put small, locally owned companies out of business. So, for example, if Amazon can get cities to bid against one another for tax breaks to give to them so that they can get an Amazon warehouse, say, placed in their neighborhood or placed in that city. And this is kind of a common practice that big businesses can kind of negotiate and haggle for these for tax breaks of various sorts. But then Howard and Kelly go on. They say, capital bias also lies more deeply in the basic economic architecture and norms and institutions and asset ownership. So, for example, they say speculative investors holding stock shares for minutes enjoy the rights of owners and the return on this minute-held investment, while employees working at a corporation for decades are dispossessed. They own no claim on the profits that they helped to create. And so also in chapter 1, Howard and Kelly expand on this idea of capital bias. So they say the extractive economy is about the privilege of the few. The capital bias at its core is rooted in the human heart and the perpetual quest for status. This value system is given expression through institutions, processes, and policies favoring those who possess wealth, capital, the shareholders as opposed to the wage earners. Values and institutions combine to create an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between the owners of capital and everyone else, i.e. the wage earners. So here, this is just a similar story to the one that Schweikert and Anderson have told. They have a similar understanding of a kind of domination that's occurring in the economy at large. There's an unequal consideration of interest between these two classes. That's the starting point of Kelly and Howard's book. That's the starting premise of what they go on to describe. Now, they have this big idea. Their big idea is that, look, there's this kind of domination relationship where some people's interests are systematically being given lesser consideration than others, and it happens to fall along these lines where it's the owners of wealth whose interests are given greater consideration than those who don't have wealth but mainly have to work for a living and get a salary. Their big idea is to put things into place that spreads the wealth around, where you get a kind of social ownership of wealth. Now, kind of old school, you might nationalize wealth. You might put wealth in the hands of the state. So in a sense, all the citizens of the state would own the wealth. You might nationalize infrastructure like the railways, or like say the highways here or something like that. So you might try to socialize the ownership of big assets in the society. This book doesn't focus on that kind of thing. It focuses on different ways of doing this that don't involve like these big nationalization projects. One example they cite is member-owned credit unions. So say in Westdale, there's this PACE credit union. In Dundas, where I used to live, there's First Ontario Credit Union. You folks may have noticed that some banking places are called credit unions and some are banks. The big difference is that banks are owned by shareholders, whereas credit unions are owned by the folks that put their money in the credit unions. In the credit unions, you get a share in the company, in the credit union that's proportionate to how much money you put into the credit union. So the people who are the clients of the credit union are also in a sense, the owners of it. Another way of spreading wealth around is through agricultural cooperatives. There are indigenous community cooperatives, and there are workers' cooperatives, which Anderson began to say some things about, and Schweikert said a bit about. What the focus of this book is on things at the level of indigenous community cooperatives, and I'll say a bit more about one of these here in a second. That's the focus of chapter 2, and workers' cooperatives. And one thing to keep in mind is that unlike Schweikert, and also I think unlike Anderson, Howard and Kelly are not proposing that much be done, at least at first, legislatively. Like they're not trying to reconfigure through the enactment of laws or the change in the economy or change in this capitalist ownership structure. What they're doing is saying, hey, we can just use the corporate forms that are available now. We can use the laws that are available now to just start doing this thing. Just start building things like Mondragon or things like workers' cooperatives, which I'll describe in a bit, and indigenous community cooperatives, where the form of business organization is one where the people who work there or who live there own the main major assets and they profit and prosper from those assets. Let me say a bit more about that. First, let me describe what one of the main models is. And here, I'm going to describe this model, and what I'm hoping will happen in discussion sections at some point. I might even ask a question somewhere along the way, either in the final assessment or maybe as a response prompt. Here, I'd love to hear anyone, I'd love to hear y'all's ideas about whether you think anything like this might make sense in Hamilton, and what exactly it might do. But here, let me give you the basic idea. So the kind of model that Howard and Kelly discuss at length throughout the book, they discuss other models as well, but this is one of the main ones, is what you might call an anchor institution model. So and it's an anchor institution model of a worker-owned cooperative. And the idea is what you do is you look for an anchor institution, meaning it's an institution that's just kind of tied to place. Like say Hamilton Health Sciences, the hospitals around here, or in the United States, there are various, there's like the Mayo Clinic in Cleveland and things like that. So you've got hospital systems that are tied to place. McMaster University or the University of Wisconsin, or the universities are tied to place. They're not going anywhere. They'll be where they are for hundreds of years. City governments are the same way. Now, the idea is that hospital systems and universities and to some extent city governments, they need services from outside vendors. Hospital systems need people to, do their laundry. Universities need people to do, you need companies, say, to do catering or maybe take care of the grounds, or, there's all kinds of things that they need. So the idea is to find niches, our needs of these anchor institutions that can be served by worker-owned cooperatives. And the idea is then to set up institutional form, a company form of worker cooperative where the workers own the company as a whole. And so they make these management decisions, and they try to work things out, and they also do the labor. But they get all of the profits. They get the workers in these things. They'll get their pay, and they'll get some sort of profit bonus on top of that, because within worker-owned cooperative, there's no capitalist shareholder that owns the thing that is taking their cut of the profits. So the idea, this idea is to find anchor institutions in various cities where that have certain needs, and try to put in place worker-owned cooperatives that can then serve those needs. And the idea is to kind of seed a little constellation or a cluster, a little economy, an ecology of worker cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, where you start at the anchor institutions and then branch out. Maybe you don't rely just on those anchor institutions after getting a foothold in the economy through the anchor institutions. So some key examples discussed in the book are, one is the Cleveland model, and this really makes up 3 different cooperatives. Evergreen Laundry, they basically do the hospital's laundry in Cleveland. Green City Growers, they provide produce of various sorts. And Evergreen Energy Solutions, so it's there in the name. But these are all worker-owned cooperatives, and the idea is that these are run and managed and owned, and hence all the profits stay within these cooperatives. There are similar initiatives that are kind of popping up throughout the world. Some really well-known ones are in Preston, in the United Kingdom, and in Portland, Oregon. But there are many others besides, and the book talks about these. The book is largely a case study of cooperatives like this and other forms of cooperative community ownership. Okay. Now, one thing I'll mention is, and I'll just connect this back to our earlier slides. Remember Chris Brown? Chris Brown, he's in Cleveland, and he comes from this impoverished neighborhood, and this is he comes from a neighborhood that suffered under racial inequalities in the U.S. Well, he was one of the folks that was involved in the early stages of Evergreen Laundry, and that form of cooperative, the opportunities that becoming a member of that cooperative gave him, helped him, work his way out of the poverty he was facing. And one of the ideas of the authors is it's particularly important to place cooperatives like this in benighted or impoverished communities to be so, because the cooperatives can be a kind of lifeline for folks who are mired in the poverty of those communities. And sometimes those communities are impoverished along fault lines of race and racial injustice, but not always. Okay, now let me just mention, I'm not going to tediously go through all of these in the detail that the book does, but I'll invite you to kind of read the book on the way the book's organized is it says, look, there are these 7 principles of community ownership or community wealth that each of the organizations they describe seek to embody, where workers and cooperatives of the kind I just described are trying to do this. And in fact, each chapter, starting at chapter 2, is devoted to a case study that expands upon one of these principles. So, for example, chapter 2 takes community to be its main principle that it focuses on, and then chapter 3, takes another principle, and on and on and on. But anyway, let me just quickly mention what these are. So the idea is that these community wealth building forms of economic organization, they're supposed to embody this principle of community. And the idea here is that it's important to take care of the immediate community to make sure that it is healthy, because there's this more general idea that people don't thrive as isolated individuals. They thrive when they're embedded in flourishing communities. So the idea is that the health of the community is intimately connected to the well-being and health of the individuals who live within the community. So that's a central focus. Inclusion, creating opportunity for those long excluded from the societal wealth. That's a really important principle. Place, keeping the wealth local as opposed to getting funneled off far away from the community. To keep the wealth and the money flowing and circulating internally. That's one of the key ideas. Fourth, good work. The idea is that, look, we want to these vehicles, these firms should have as their focus providing good work at a living wage for the people that work there. So work that's not tedious, work that's uplifting, and work that pays reasonably well. Another key feature is, and we've talked about this at length, so I'll say very little about it here, is democratized ownership, where everyone involved, all the workers involved, own the assets jointly. There's sustainability. A key principle is to bring firms in that are doing things in a way that protect the ecosystem as the foundation of life. And finally, there's this notion of ethical finance, where social and ecological benefit is the aim of the firms, and then making money is the result if the social and when the social and ecological benefits are pursued well. Okay, so those are the 7 principles. And now let's think about this worker-owned cooperative, the anchor institution model. The idea here would be, this might help a little bit to kind of illustrate this. So here, this is something that's been floating around on the internet, and largely in response to what's going on in the States with the Floyd, and sparked protests. This comes, I give the link to the page where this graphic can be found. The link I opened one of my opening slides had this link. This graphic describes the segregated nature of Madison, Wisconsin. And one thing I would say is that a lot of cities in the United States are segregated in this way. It's not like there are rules that segregate them, but just for all kinds of reasons, these patterns have occurred where there'll be parts of the community that are primarily black or black and Hispanic. This graphic is a graphic of the crescent of black Hispanic neighborhoods in Madison, Wisconsin. And you can see this red dotted line. This is, you kind of follow this red dotted line around, and you have this kind of chain of predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods going through Madison, Wisconsin. And then the rest of the city, is mainly white. Okay, so you have this crescent, and one thing the website that I linked to shows is all kinds of disparities of wealth, income, and life prospects that follow this graphic. So one of the more revealing graphics shows clusters of people who are incarcerated and the numbers of people who are incarcerated. And as you might expect, and then they do this by putting like little pinpoints in the map, like the houses, the folks that are incarcerated, where they live before they're incarcerated. And as you might expect, you get like a chain that kind of follows this crescent. They have another crescent of academic performance, how well kids are doing in school, and the really poorly performing students go to the weaker schools, all almost perfectly in line with this crescent. There's something similar. There's a similar graphic of wealth that parallels the thing I was saying earlier about Boston, where the median wealth of a black family in Boston was $8, and the median wealth of a white family in Boston is like $280,000 or something like that. There's graphics like that. It just perfectly follows this little crescent. Okay, so the idea is that you have these kind of segregated wells of poverty in the U.S., and oftentimes, they fall along racial lines, and that cranks a lot of the racial injustice that you see in the U.S. And then one of the ideas is the form of cooperative that these folks have in mind could do a lot of work in helping remedy these kinds of injustices of inequality. Whether it's along racial lines or not, the idea is that, but if you introduce a worker cooperative into these neighborhoods, and what you try to do is you try to find folks in these neighborhoods who will be the employees in these worker cooperatives, and you empower them by giving them ownership stake in these cooperatives. Then that begins to the idea is to supply a foothold of wealth into these neighborhoods. And then other things are supposed to happen once you do that. Because the idea is that, look, if you have folks in neighborhoods like this that own the cooperative, that say is doing the laundry for say the hospital system in Madison, Wisconsin. Cleveland actually does have something like this. Cleveland actually does have a segregated neighborhoods like this. But putting that aside, let's go back to Wisconsin here. Say you did put a cooperative in that's like Evergreen Laundry in Cleveland, and this cooperative is owned by folks who live in these neighborhoods. And a feature of these cooperatives is that the profits, rather than going to some shareholder that might not or likely doesn't live in the city at all, and almost certainly if they do live in the city, they live in the wealthy parts of the city, not these impoverished parts. The idea is that you put these worker cooperatives in place, and these folks are getting profits that are cycling back into the city. And so you're realizing these principles, these 7 principles principles of inclusion, principles of building the community, uh, principles of place, keeping the wealth local, principles of democratic ownership, principles of ethical finance. So the idea is that these workers' cooperatives can be vehicles for revitalizing communities, keeping the wealth local, and restoring a kind of equality of wealth and dynamism to these economically disadvantaged communities. Uh, but I should take care here to say that their idea is broader than that. This need not simply fall along racial lines, and it need not simply fall along the most dire inequalities of wealth lines. It's something that could that the thought is that can apply just more broadly to rectify these larger macro inequalities between say the very wealthiest shareholders and your rank and file employees more generally. But this is a very stark illustration of the logic of this initiative and the kind of good Kelly and Howard hope this kind of initiative can do. Okay, let me just finish with just a few words about Chapter 2 of Kelly and Howard. And here they talk about a Native American community, the Lakota community in South Dakota. And this is a community that has, until recently, had employment that would just typically be as high as 85%. That's just mind-bogglingly depressing. Something to know, just to kind of locate in our history and in culture and in time, this Lakota community. This is where the Wounded Knee Massacre happened back in 1890, and this is where the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Massacred several hundred Lakota. About half of them were women and children, and this is kind of known as like the last great battle between the American armed forces and Native American populations. Our massacre is probably it seems to be a more accurate description. So this is a community that it's an indigenous community that's been marginalized historically and treated very badly in these ways, and the people have suffered and been disconnected from their culture and from their way of life and their way of obtaining, basic sustenance and means of living. And what Kelly and Howard describe is a community wealth initiative initiated by members of the Lakota community that is supposed to be illustrative of the kind of thing that these community wealth initiatives can do. And I'll just say a bit about this. One of the main players is this Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. And this thing was, kind of the person who spearheaded it is this member of the Lakota community, Nick Tilson. And what this is it's a $60 million regenerative community on 34 acres owned by this corporation. And it features this, at the heart of this is this complex of affordable homes and rentals and powwow grounds, an amphitheater, playground, basketball courts, a skate park. One of the main ideas is that residents build their own homes with the help of the resources of the corporation, and they get ownership of their homes by participating in the construction and putting their sweat equity into it. And the idea is that by gaining that wealth, that begins to empower and enrich these folks. This corporation, this community, this regenerative community, part of the design is stores and spaces for incubating Native-owned businesses and a workforce training center. One of the key actors, one of the key, sub-cooperatives is this Takaga Construction Cooperative. And this is an employee-owned community business that's been launched. And, what it does is it's part of this. It's part of the construction process for all this stuff, for the homes and the businesses and all the stuff that's described here. Also part of this cluster is a social enterprise program to help launch multiple Indian-owned businesses. One is Thunder Valley Farms, that has that at the outset is focused on poultry. There's a Quilters Cooperative. And then another feature of this whole thing is that it's supposed to be regenerative. It's a sustainable system. It's all powered, or it's largely powered by passive solar, and there's 100% water reclamation. So anyway, the idea is that the point of this whole initiative is to empower the members of this community by giving them access to wealth, helping them become owners of their own social space and their own economic units. And the idea and the hope is that this is the way to help folks thrive once more. Okay, so I'm not going to say any more about this, other than Chapter 2 is an extensive case study of what's going on there, and a consideration of, and an assessment, and an account of how this particular initiative, answers to the principles of community wealth, those 7 principles, and with a special focus on this principle of community. And in the remainder chapters, are other case studies of other initiatives, community wealth initiatives, doing the same thing, like just explaining how that connects to these larger ambitions, and ultimately connects to this bigger project of rectifying this kind of domination, or this unequal consideration of interest that we see in the economy as large. And the way to do that is just to create as many of these worker-owned or community-owned centers of wealth and wealth generation, so thereby, marginalizing or moving off stage the role of the capitalist who, has a kind of conflict of interest with the workers in the larger population. Okay. That was my last substantive lecture for the course. I'll appear a few more times. I might say a little bit about the remaining chapters. I'll say very little. What you'll be held accountable for on the final assessment will be basically the material covered in this lecture and back, and prior material. Going forward, I really do want us to move to synthesizing and finishing up our last papers. On Thursday, we will discuss what's going on in the Howard and Kelly book, but we'll also be pivoting toward this larger synthesis project and getting you folks ready for the final assessment. Thanks a lot.